Right, guys, welcome back to Ruckus Media. And for those that have been following a lot of what we've been talking about over the last couple of months, pandemic time, you'll know that we've been talking to Mark Hunt as well as Maynard about what's been going on with the UFC, and in particular, this antitrust hearing that took place during the course of last year. And with us today is a man who is very, very familiar with what's going on in the background. Rob Maysey, welcome to Ruckus Media. You're from the MMA Fighters Association. Thank you so much for your time out of Arizona tonight.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So, Rob, like I mentioned in the intro, I've previously spoken to Mark Hunt and to Maynard about their experiences and why they are actively going up against the UFC, particularly with regards to fighter pay. I mean, we've seen most recently John Jones, Jorge Masvidal also putting their 5 cents into all of the comments that have been made by a number of athletes. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the likes of Lee Kung, Nate Quarry, and John Fitch as well. But a bit of background about yourself. I mean, your background is in sport. You were originally or essentially a baseball player. And I mean, you know a lot about how player associations work. And you're now obviously part and parcel of the MMA Fighters Association.
Yeah, so I played baseball up through college. My brother was a professional baseball player, so I watched him go through the minor leagues. He eventually made it to the major leagues. There was a point in his career where one of the GMs for the Pirates came to him and said, "I need you to cross the line." This was back in 1994, I believe, when the players went on strike. My brother said, "No, I can't do it." Got asked again. Brother said, "No, I can't do it." So the GM went to him and another pitcher. His name was John Hope, who was a star at the time, and basically told them they're going to rot in Double-A. Since they didn't help him out, I'm not helping you out. And that's essentially what happened. They spent the entire year in the minor leagues, despite having very good seasons. So that was kind of, I would have been about 17 to 19 years old during that time frame, and it was kind of very formative on how I viewed sports. It was a business, how athletes are kind of, widgets in a much larger machine, and what the associations do to protect the athletes.
And now you find yourself part and parcel of the MMA Fighters Association. Just a brief history, how did that come about, and how did you find yourself in the situation where you are now really fighting for every single professional fighter across the world?
Yeah, so in law school, obviously I wasn't playing baseball anymore. I joined a jiu-jitsu club, and we used to have our jiu-jitsu practices in the wrestling room. So we would basically practice with Cornell wrestlers. So we were already kind of, my introduction was with sort of an elite, set of athletes. Cornell wrestlers are very, very good. When I finished law school, I moved to LA, and I ended up in Eddie Bravo's 10th Planet gym. One of our instructors and teammates, called them teammates because we practice with them 5 nights a week, go to tournaments with them. He gets a call, and this would have been 2003, to be in the UFC, and we all thought this was awesome. So the school basically, all the teammates get together and say, "Hey, we're going to go out to Vegas and watch Gerald fight." He was fighting Josh Thompson, and I believe it was UFC 42. So that was my first event, and at that time, I'm an attorney who is doing jiu-jitsu as a sport. I loved it as a sport. And I was kind of, I was an enormous fan. So we show up to that event, and at that time, it was almost the reverse of what you see now. So during the undercard, the lower bowl would be almost full. And that was because that was all the school gyms and teammates and, fans of the fighters were buying the lower bowl. So that was full from the very first prelim fight. And then the upper bowls would fill up as the main card started. It was kind of bizarre to watch this evolution. So anyway, after Gerald's fight, he comes out to the crowd to where we're sitting, and he's asking to borrow money to get home to Oregon. And I'm like, what? So the following week, I'm starting to figure out how, I'm looking around. There's 16,000 people at this event. I know what they were selling merch for. I know the lines were 50 people deep. I know these events are on pay-per-view, and I'm starting to do the calculations in my head, and it wasn't making sense at all. So at that time, fighters would get paid $2,000 to show, $2,000 to win.
Yep.
At the entry level. He didn't win, so his purse would have been $2,000. But before he gets to fight, he's paying for his medicals, he's paying for his corners,
Yeah.
He's paying for any extra hotel rooms, and ultimately, virtually all of those guys, I came to find out, fighting at that entry level are paying to fight, because that purse is not covering their expenses. Guys at that time were living in gyms. That was very, very common. They would have, side jobs, oftentimes through the gym, in order to support their training, to try and make this a career. So very soon after that, I went from fan to, I started to get involved, because I knew I just sort of had, it was a confluence of interest and expertise. I knew what antitrust did in sport. I knew what associations do and how they can be used. And I was involved in jiu-jitsu. I loved it. So very soon after, I ended up doing a small claims suit for Erica Montoya, and that was against King of the Cage for non-payment, and for Chris Brennan against Pride, for not offering fights, essentially.
Yeah.
And this would have been 2004, 2005, which is when I fully started pitching the Mixed Martial Arts Fighters Association. And that took a while. I mean, for a period of probably 3-4 years, I'm writing articles, I'm making statements, and in large part, I'm talking to myself.
Yeah.
People don't know this, but I had a very small circle of contacts out of Southern California. And outside of that, nobody knew me. Well, that finally changed when there was a promotion called Elite XC. I don't know if you remember them. Kimbo Slice fought for them.
Correct.
They did big event shows for about an 18-month period of time. They were on CBS. Well, anyway, so Elite XC had, I don't know, 60, 70 fighters under contract, and it became sort of obvious they weren't going to run any more shows, but they weren't releasing fighters. So ultimately what happens is one of the attorneys for one of the prominent agents comes to me and he says, hey, how can we get out of these contracts? Because they're not letting us go. We're not getting fights. We're just sitting there. And in months had passed. And I said, well, you could file suit individually seeking, a declaratory action that these contracts are now voided because. But in order to do that, you're going to have to file or pay filing fees and service fees for each fighter.
Every single one of them, yeah.
Every single one of them. And he starts adding up the numbers, and he's like, well, that's going to cost, my agent alone, $7,000. I said, yeah, exactly right. And that's just a small subset of them. But we can do it as an association and file just one on behalf of all of them. And that's because we're not seeking individualized damages. We're seeking a ruling from the court that says these contracts are void. And he's like, can we do that? And I said, yeah, we can do that. And I sent him the case law from the Ninth Circuit and the Supreme Court showing an association has standing to pursue actions on behalf of members. Ultimately, that's what we did. We drafted a complaint. We sent a demand letter to Elite XC saying, if this is not resolved within, I believe we gave them 8 days, we're going to file this complaint. And what ended up happening very soon after that is they settled with Strikeforce, and they released the contracts to Strikeforce, which was essentially what many of the plaintiffs in our proposed lawsuit wanted. They wanted to be released to Coker to get fights. They wanted fights. That was kind of the first proof that I had to everybody else. An association has power. And
so Rob, if I can just jump
yes.
in here. So the MMA association, Fighters Association, essentially had already been formed by then, but like you say, just a very small closed circle of people knew about it.
Yes, very accurately. And by formed, it was formed to the extent that I had a website, I had a logo, I had a draft of bylaws, a draft constitution, and a draft membership statement. And I call all of those draft. I still call them all draft because ultimately what happens is once you get a big enough pool of fighters adopt the idea we're going to form our association, they will vote to ratify or amend or whatever.
Yeah.
It's not something that I can impose on them. I can present them as drafts. Hey, what do you guys think? Are these approved or not? And there'll be a ratification vote somewhere down the line. That hasn't happened yet. But in terms of formation in that, I now had a logo, I had a site, I had the documents, and I was approaching people to discuss the idea with them. That started in 2005, and I didn't get any traction really at all until after that Elite XC suit. And the difference was now I could call up virtually any of the Asians and say, hey, I'm going to be in town, let's meet. And they would meet.
And tell me, Rob, at that time, how many members did you have? So let's talk before Elite. How many members did you officially have as part of this MMA Fighters Association?
So I've never, and there's reasons for this. I've never given numbers, and I won't give numbers for a few reasons. One is if I peg it to timeframes, it's easy to see who was and who wasn't. And I've always said, I'm not outing you unless you out yourself. That's it's just a trust thing. The second reason I don't name numbers, and I'll answer your question indirectly in a moment, is inevitably I found that the follow-up question I have is always, or it has been, questions designed to figure out who those guys are or who those women are, which I can't answer for obvious reasons. Now, to answer your question, back in 06, 07, 08, the number wasn't large. I'll say that. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly what it was, but it was a small group.
And in terms of that small group, and once again, the intention here is not to try and out who it is. I'm assuming in getting that small group and growing the membership, you've obviously had to commit to this non-disclosure, obviously to keep their identities sort of safe, but also to prove to everybody else that what you say you're going to do, you're going to deliver on.
100%. And I have found, and I was kind of taught this, thankfully, by my dad growing up and also on my first jobs, don't commit to something you're not going to do, which is, me as kind of an outsider. There's been a lot of people coming in making all kinds of boisterous comments about how they're going to come in and change the sport, and MMAFA has been too slow and this and that. Well, the one difference is we've been very clear. We are here to do two things: enforce antitrust and get the Ali Expansion Act passed. We are going to do those two things. We never say there's a 1-year clock on this. We're going to have X, Y, and Z done in 18 months because we don't know. We don't control that. The only two things we control is we are going to be doing this until those two things happen. And we have been. We're the only ones.
Just coming back to the MMAFA, is it primarily only for professional fighters?
Yes. Now that doesn't mean it's just for professional fighters, but just like any other association or organization, ultimately what happens is there'll be sort of a tiering that takes place at some point, and the distinction will be essentially the athletes whose fights generate revenue compared to the other athletes. And that's not to say the other athletes don't receive any benefit, because we think they will, in a number of ways. As the professional tier becomes more and more successful, they're going to obtain contract changes that this amateur tier never could. They're going to benefit from that just vicariously. Yeah. They're going to have more rights available to them in the future as they become professionals, because their ancillary rights are no longer being stolen. Rankings are very, very important. This is why we want the Expansion Act passed. It needs to be passed. Once rankings are a property right of the fighter, there's now value that transfers from the promoter to the fighter in particular, because the promoter can't strip that away from them. It's the fighter's rank, fighter's title. Whereas as it is now, the promoter dictates both to the talent. That's not even a sport. That is literally how a reality TV show is run.
Exactly.
The producers decide who's moving up the ladder. That's not sport.
So I just want to come back to the amateur versus professional thing, because obviously, as I'm sure you know, I mean, IMAF already are giving away fight purses for international tournaments. So now essentially amateurs are earning fight purses, which in many environments, by definition, makes them professionals because they are making money out of fighting. So like you say, down the line, there will obviously be a tiered structure where non-professional athletes, people that are generating a revenue out of fighting, will be able to join the MMAFA.
Yeah, and we've kind of always been of the view that everyone can join. It's just, somewhere down the road, the benefits will be tiered, and that's because, a guy, just use any example. Conor McGregor's interests are not the same as, the local fighter who fights once every 18 months in Tempe, Arizona, right? One person, it's a career, they're generating millions and millions in revenue, and the other guy, he's a local level talent who has not progressed and may not want to, may not have the talent to. He's just not progressing beyond that local level, which is okay. It's just, like in baseball, the baseball union does not cover the Kalamazoo Owls, some tiny local independent quasi-professional team. It's not the same tier of player that reaches the major leagues. So essentially, in order to get group cohesiveness, and to sort of secure the most power that they could, they tiered it, and their tiers are the major league pool and essentially everybody else. Now, that doesn't mean, again, benefits will flow down to everybody else.
Right.
It's just, Conor McGregor's licensing image rights are not being shared with somebody who hasn't earned $1 fighting yet or hasn't generated $1 in revenue.
Agreed.
That's the distinction they draw.
Right. So let's come back to that point that you were making about the UFC currently, the way they control both rank and title, and your point being that until the athlete owns their rank and the athlete owns their title, they absolutely have zero value to trade with any promotion. And in this case, it's the UFC. And until that changes, we know what happens. We've heard about it. We heard Jorge Masvidal talk about it very recently. The fact that for him to get a fight, he has to sign fight extensions. And the higher you go up their ranking, and here I'm talking UFC, the longer those contracts seem to get.
100%. And this is, sort of, you're seeing a little bit behind the curtain now. A lot of this factual information that is now being, sort of dispersed throughout the general public, people think is new, or people think fighters are just now starting to talk about. We think, not coincidentally, as this information got released in disclosures from the antitrust suit, all of a sudden writers could now talk about it confidently. They could publish the sources, and the sources were Zuffa's own documents.
Yeah, yes.
It was no longer, in fact, you don't even hear Dana White coming out and saying now they're making up those numbers, because he can't. They're not making up those numbers. Those numbers are accurate.
Yeah.
They're from Zuffa's own documents that have been disclosed by Zuffa in a lawsuit. Now, all of that said, I'm sorry, I totally lost my train of thought.
We're talking about Zuffa's documents, and the fact that all of this information that's coming out now is their information that they were forced to give at that antitrust suit when they had to disclose everything to defend against what Lee Kung, Nate Quarry, and John Fitch were alleging.
Yes. So, I've been asked a number of times, isn't it, curious that all these star fighters are just now starting to go public? We didn't hear, the John Joneses and Jorge Masvidal's complaining in the past. And our view is, no, it's not strange at all. These complaints have been there. We've known about them since '05, really. The only distinction now is they're no longer guessing. Tito's no longer relying on, well, I heard Chuck got this, or I think Randy got that. It's no, we know what they're getting. We know what you guys are getting paid. We know what the percentage is, and Zuffa can't even deny it anymore. So now this new pool of fighters who's coming up, who's getting, into their peak earnings generation part of their careers, John Jones and Masvidal,
yeah,
they realize, well, shoot, I only have a handful of these in my entire career. If I want to make hay, now's the time. And they get to the point where they should have leverage, and they figure out, oh, gee, I don't. So the way it works in martial arts now, and it's not just the UFC, it's all the promoters do this. They control rank and title. And the reason that matters is, what's the big sport in South Africa? Is it soccer or cricket?
The biggest sport by numbers is football, correct? And then
okay, so football,
cricket and rugby, yeah.
Yeah, so in football, imagine the South African national team. I'm not sure. I think they're professional, but I'm not sure. Let's assume they're professional.
Yes, they are.
Is competing in an international tournament, and they win their first 4 matches, and they should be entitled to move on to match play in a playoffs in order to compete for a world title. And the owner of the event comes in and says, well, South Africa's a little too little and not so exciting. We would much rather prefer Brazil.
Yeah.
So we're just going to swap them out. Sorry, South Africa. And literally, that's what's being done in MMA. It's the result of matches does not dictate my ascension to a path to a title, which is how combat sports athletes monetize their careers. The promoter alone dictates whether you fight a higher ranked opponent and therefore can move up the rankings ladder, and they alone decide who gets title fights. And inevitably, what you've seen is, you'll hear Dana White say, and the way he does it is, hey, so is Aljamain Sterling up for the next title fight? And Dana White's response is usually something like, well, we have a number of guys, we'll have to see what happens. And what he's really saying is,
or we'll work
see
it out.
Aljamain signs his 10-fight extension.
Yeah, yeah.
Because if he doesn't sign that extension, he's not ready. We'll go to the next guy.
I love his favorite line when he throws we'll work something out. And that to me is always, hold on, that's code for he's got to put his signature on the dotted line of something we haven't yet received back from him.
That's entirely correct. Now, in the Ali Act world, what would happen is you'd have guys like Conor and guys like Aljamain, let's say Aljamain has reached the point where he's a number one ranked contender in his weight class, and he's got 1 fight left on his promotional agreement. Well, as it stands now, the UFC is coming to Aljamain and saying, hey, you got 1 fight left. We'll give you some guy nobody's ever heard of in a bad location on short notice. And if you decline it, we'll extend you. Or we'll give you a title fight. Here's your new 10-fight title, or your new 10-fight extension. And they lock his pay in for the next 3-4 years of his career or more. 10 fights, do the math. They're fighting twice a year at that level. And that's without injury, without extension. And if Aljo refuses that, his pay is very low, even if he's fighting at the top of the food chain.
Yeah.
And he has no transferability, meaning if he reaches the end of his Zuffa contract, he's then got to sit out an exclusive negotiating period He's then got to sit out the right of matching. You know, Zuffa gets the right to match any third-party promoter, which discourages any bids whatsoever.
Yeah.
Let's hypothetically assume he gets to the end of all of that. He can't go to Bellator and say, Bellator, I'm next in line for the title. I have a lot of value to you.
He's got to work from the bottom up.
Yeah, Bellator turns to him and says, what value? Your rank disappeared when you left Zuffa. You're not ranked.
Yep.
That kills his value. So when people today are saying, oh, he's testing free agency, there is no free agency unless rank and title are independent of those promotions, because now those promotions actually have to compete for the Aljos. We want to promote title fighters. Aljo's in line to fight for titles. Now they've got a bid on him. And that's kind of the element they've removed from this by deciding who fights for titles and hinging that on long-term extensions. They are never free agents at the time when they can make the most money.
Talking about all of this made me think a lot about what transpired. I can't remember, a month or 2 months ago, when we had this influx of Joe Silva stories. That must have had you smiling. That must have had you chuckling, because we had everybody, Eddie Alvarez. We had, I mean, you just name them. They were talking about all of these bizarre stories about how Joe Silva would actually treat them like utter dirt, particularly those guys that were coming to the end of their contracts, giving them those really, really tough fights in the hope that they either get beaten, which then means they no longer have to honor their word of those title fights, and to try and get out of those hard fights, sign the long-term contract.
Yes. Now the Joe Silva hashtag. I mean, I guess the satisfactory thing to us, kind of, you know, sitting on our side of the evolution of the sport, is, again, we've been hearing these stories since the mid 2000s, and there was a period of many years where we were called liars, we were called frauds, we were told you have no sources. It's just that weirdo attorney in Arizona, Maysey, making up stories. And then you had a handful of writers start to talk about it. Josh Gross, in particular, was very early. Same thing. He's a fraud. He's inventing sources. From that aspect, it's been a little satisfying. The public is finally starting to see things we've known for a long time. But for whatever reason, they weren't being spoken about in public yet, or there was not yet proofs. Well, now both of those things are changing.
So, Rob, long story now. You've come through all of that. You had the antitrust suit, what was it, last year? A lot of information came out of that antitrust, which we spoke about earlier. A lot of that information has given a lot of fighters a little bit more confidence to come out and talk confidently about their experiences and hoping that the UFC is not going to sort of bench them and not let them earn a living. I mean, we all know good sport, proper sport, and I'm not saying MMA is not good sport, not proper sport, but good and proper sport dictates that merit determines your rise up the ranks. We know within the UFC that's not the case. In fact, there have been a lot of calls here in South Africa. I'm sure you know about the EFC, where a lot of guys feel that the same may be taking place there, with the UFC not actually having, the EFC not actually having a ranking system at all. And it's purely them and their matchmakers that determine who fights whom and when and for what.
Yes. Now, for your fans in South Africa, the UFC up until, and I'm going to be off by a year or two probably because I'm going from memory, but up until the time they signed a television deal with Fox, they took the exact same approach. We don't even recognize rankings internally ourselves, so why would we recognize any third-party rankings? That was their public stance for years. The only reason that changed is once they signed a contract with a TV network that sort of has a broader mass audience appeal, that the networks go to them and say, no, 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 no. For us to advertise these fights, we need rankings. So the UFC, lo and behold, overnight adopts UFC rankings, but they control who's on the panel. They basically dictate, what happens with those rankings, and they're advisory only. They're not actually used. So as part of we were in Congress, our House of Representatives, our congressional body, lobbying for the Ali Expansion Act, and this is one of our major points. Essentially, this is a reality show with sanctioned violence. That's what's being sold to the public as championship sport. And they'd say, what do you mean? And I'd say, well, what other sport does the owner of the event get to dictate who competes in the playoffs? and by who competes in the playoffs, it's who's got the best and most favorable contracts for us.
Correct.
And for the people who refuse to sign those favorable contracts, they just don't make the playoffs. They're like, that's what's happening? I'm like, yes, that's what's happening. It's happened over and over and over repeatedly.
And Rob, all of this very reminiscent of Don King pre-Ali Act, not affording any contender the opportunity to fight a champion unless that individual signed a lucrative contract with Don King.
Yes, that's 100% true. A lot of the legislative history surrounding the Ali Act is, in one way or another, related to conduct of Don King. Now, that's not to say the Ali Act came in and cleaned up boxing and solved all ills. It didn't do that.
No.
But, and this is kind of the difference that we are proposing, if we have an association to enforce the Ali Act that is not being enforced by the Association of Boxing Commissions or state attorney generals, fighters typically don't have the money or the resources to pursue individual actions, but an association that could enforce the act on behalf of all members, that has real power. We could do a lot in a very short period of time to basically enforce changes when that act comes into place. And in large part, that's because once we're successful on one suit, that act has an attorney's fees provision. So the promoter is going to be paying the association's attorney's fees if we're successful on the suit and enforcing the act, and we believe we will be. We go to the second promoters doing the same thing, and we send them a letter that says, here's what's going to happen, and if we have to litigate it, you're going to owe us approximately this amount of money, which is what we recovered in our prior lawsuit. It gives us, leverage over the promoters now that doesn't exist for any fighter. Yeah. That's kind of a game changer. We don't want to, sort of delude people into thinking the Ali Act cures everything. It doesn't, but it gives us a big tool and hammer that doesn't exist now to start enforcing things that should be happening in the sport that aren't happening yet.
So just in summary, Rob. So Ali Act, we know it came into existence. What it has done is it has removed rank and title from the promoters. They are now independently owned, independently run, which is why in a boxing sense we have multiple different titles. We have multiple different associations. We have gold belts, silver belts, diamond belts, all manner of belt, all as a way of making money. We also know that part of the Ali Act, there are mandatory agreement periods. There are first bid processes. There's the whole concept of free agency. And then a key one is the concept of revealing all revenues for events. Now, the UFC of late have been, can I say, fairly decent at revealing fight purses, win show bonuses, all that kind of stuff. But correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure I recently saw somewhere that Nevada State Athletic Commission has now put out a statement that they will no longer divulge those purses?
Yes, that's correct. Florida did the same thing a few years back. I want to say it was about 3-4 years ago. Florida used to also disclose through their athletic commission's purse levels. And due to lobbying, Zuffa lobbies, They lobbied in Florida, and I'm sure they have been in Nevada as well, to get those considered confidential records. So now those amounts will no longer be public. Now, under the Ali Act, the promoter does have to disclose to the fighter all revenues contracted to be earned from that event by the promoter. And that's before the promoter can deduct any pay from the revenues. They have to sign an affidavit that says, here are all the revenues we're contracted to receive from this event, and provide it to the fighter. Now, again, there are some games the promoters play with that in terms of timing of the disclosures, but that's way better than fighters in MMA have now, where the promoter generally doesn't disclose anything other than what was required to be disclosed to the athletic commissions in terms of purses. And even that was kind of deceptive in to the extent that a lot of the pay in mixed martial arts has been by side letter, meaning that they never had to disclose it to the athletic commission at all. The other kind of sort of bizarre development in MMA from our point of view is you have these athletic commissions whose sort of public mission is to protect fighters in an inherently dangerous combat sport. Our goal is to protect fighters for the benefit of the public that they serve. Well, these same athletic commissions are now taking the position that not only are we not collecting anything but bout agreements from promoters, we're not collecting any of the agreements at all they have with the fighter. So how can they rationally govern a dispute that occurs between the promoter and the fighter if they don't even have the contracts?
Correct.
They didn't require them to be disclosed. They can't. That's just sort of a nonsensical position they've taken, and I think they're out in taking ridiculous positions like this. Is, well, the Ali Act doesn't apply to MMA. We want to close that loophole and say, no, what you're doing for boxing, you do for MMA as well. It's not second class. It's not your promoters lobbied and threatened to hold events elsewhere. So you basically catered to what they asked you to do, which is don't receive our agreements and hide what's actually going on.
So, Rob, in a nutshell, Ali Act extension, you guys are currently lobbying Congress to get them to extend Ali Act into the MMA circle. And that is a very different issue from the news that broke last week regarding a date being set for the motion to certify. And that is in front of the circuit judge. Am I correct?
Yes, that very well said. So this antitrust suit, a lot of people don't realize this, and when I say it, heads are going to explode. We filed this suit December 16th, 2014. We are just now getting to an order on our motion for class certification, and what that does is, the complaint as it stands now is John Fitch, Nate Quarry, Kung Lee, Brandon Vera, Javier Vasquez, and Kyle Kingsbury. It's those six. File suit on behalf of themselves and on behalf of every other UFC fighter who fits our class definition. That number ends up being around 1,215 fighters total, 1,215. What we're waiting on is for the judge to say, this lawsuit that's currently pending is for the six alone or for all 1,215. And it's a huge difference.
Yes.
We got a minute order. We got a minute order Thursday. I think it was Thursday of last week, that says we have a status hearing scheduled for September 17th regarding that order on class certification. So it's quite feasible we'll have that order ahead of September 17th. But if not, we'll probably find some things out on September 17th as to whether we're going forward as a class or not.
Well, Rob, I mean, this has been a long slog. I think, first of all, MMA Fighters Association, I mean, well done. I mean, we've been talking about it. There's been a lot of chatter about it here in South Africa in terms of protecting many of the African athletes. So I suppose you guys are pioneering new ground, and obviously that will ripple across the globe once things hopefully fall into place and work in your favor. Wish you all the success for September 17th. And we're definitely going to set up a follow-up chat with you after that to get a little bit more detail from you. And then finally, what's happening with regards to the lobbying of Congress for Ali extension?
Yeah, so the Ali extension, two things have kind of converged. One was COVID, which eliminated travel, so we couldn't travel in person, and the other is our presidential election, and then the congressional elections, which are happening really in November.
Yeah.
So what you're going to see from us is expect us to be back out in DC within the first 6 to 8 weeks of the new year. So that could be, the end of January into February.
Yeah.
We fully expect the Ali Expansion Act is going to be reintroduced, and provided we are not blocked in committee like we were last time, we believe we already have the votes to come out of the House and move to the Senate. So with luck, we will be with luck, there's a chance by the end of next year our bill will be up for signature.
Well, Rob, I wish you all the best. We will definitely be chatting a lot more between now and that bill being up for signature, definitely to get up to speed on what's happening, what the process is looking like, because we all know, I know, any fan of the sport knows that the athletes need to be looked after. They need to be able to come out of this with a lot more money than they're currently getting right now.
100%. I mean, unlike any other industry, the fighters are the product. They're not an input into the development of a product. They are the product.
Correct. So
when you're, determining who should get what, well, we're paying for the product. We're not paying to watch a logo. We're not paying to watch, promoters argue backstage. They are the product. So they definitely deserve, a far greater share of the revenues that they generate than they're getting.
Well, Maysey, thank you so much for your time. Get back to that heat that you have to experience there in Arizona. I'll enjoy the cool of the last couple of weeks of winter here in South Africa, but we're going to be talking real soon. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.